Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the third part of this class on Islamic studies in the month of Ramadan. We are affiliated with the Fairfax Institute, and for those of you who are taking this class as a regular class, which means listening to all the lectures and hopefully taking the exam that I plan to send out tomorrow, welcome back. This is the third lecture in the series. And today I'm going to give you a brief introduction to various Islamic sciences or Islamic knowledge forms or Islamic epistemes. You're welcome to describe them as you like. Before that, I want to preface the discussion in today's session with some remarks which are broadly about the importance of knowledge. We live in a society with the World Bank calls as a knowledge-based society, and for more than 10-15 years the World Bank has been describing the current economy as knowledge-based economy. As a result of the information revolution and as the proliferation of access to information because of the internet, the computers, information technology, communications technology, etc., one of the most important dimensions of globalization has been the exchange of information and flow of information. As a result, we are far better informed today than we have been in the past. I remember reading somewhere that a Sunday issue of New York Times has more information than the total amount of information that was probably available to people in the 15th century. So we have progressed tremendously as a planet, as a community, in the path and pursuit of knowledge. But unfortunately today, in most branches or elements of knowledge, the Muslim world broadly lags behind. The Arab development reports, especially the one in 2003, made a comparison of the amount of knowledge that is produced in Muslim, especially in Arab societies, and they found that the entire Arab world, composed of 22 countries, produced fewer research papers in science and mathematics than the tiny country of Israel. Israel has a population of 6 million roughly, and they produce more scientific papers in a roster of international journals than the entire Arab world combined. To give you another example of the starkness in comparison between the Muslim world and the rest of it, I mean, there are no broad indicators. No one actually tries to compare this every year so that we can plot trends, etc. But we can use some existing data to try and understand the difference. The United States routinely publishes more than 1 million books every year. The second largest number of books that are published every year are in Great Britain, which is about 250,000, 250,000 books in many languages, and in the entire Arab world about 5,000 books are published every year. So you can see the enormous difference. The population of the United States is roughly equal to the population of the Arab world. Both are 300 million plus, but the US produces 1 million books every year, and there are about 5,000 books published in the Arab world. The point that I'm trying to make is that we're living in a period of deficit of knowledge production. And this is probably the most, if not the singularly most important cause for the backwardness, decline, underdevelopment, weaknesses of the Muslim world, in general speaking. When we talk about Islam, and when we tell the story of Islam, for example, if you notice, everybody starts telling the story of Islam by talking about the period that precedes Islam as the period of Jahiliyyah. So whether we are conscious of this or not, we just talk about the Arab world before Islam as a society of the ignorant people, and then God intervenes. The first word that is revealed is to read, and then we have Islam. So we have this juxtaposition of Jahiliyyah and ignorance with Islam, which is enlightenment. And in the Quran we see in many places where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that I have extracted you. يَخْرُجُ مِنْ ظُلُمَاتِ إِلَى النُّورِ. I have been extracting you all and them from darkness into light. So Islam has been an enlightening experience for the Arab world and for Muslims generally. So we, in our minds, we intuitively think of Islam as an enlightening experience. So Islam and ignorance cannot coexist. So you cannot have Islam in ignorant societies. People sometimes define, like at least in my mind, a Muslim is probably, in any room, a Muslim is a person who is the best informed and most compassionate. So if you have a person who is best informed and most compassionate, to me he should be a Muslim, because those are the characteristics of an enlightened person. So it is in that context that I want to briefly, this is, I was describing to somebody this afternoon, that this lecture is like a buffet, that I have a spread on the table giving you a brief introduction to various Islamic knowledges. I will not go into depth in any of this. So if there is interest, please contact Dr. Naveed, and maybe we can organize another lecture later in the future on that particular subject. But to give you an idea of how rich the Islamic heritage is intellectually, one of the consequences of the colonial experience that the Muslims have had is that there has been a truncation of our history. We've been cut off. And this cutting off from our past has meant that the tradition of knowledge production has been broken, and we have been disconnected from our past. So the most striking example is that of Turkey, which actually changed the way they write their language. They used to write it using Arabic alphabets. Now they write it using Latin alphabets, which means that contemporary modern Turks are unable to read either Arabic or Persian or Ottoman Turkish. So they're disconnected as a result of this modern period, partly because of colonization and partly as an effort to modernization. In many parts of the Muslim world, we now have two different streams of education systems. We call it the secular education system and the Islamic madrasa system. And as a result of this, there is division of knowledges. Those who go to secular schools tend to be well versed in foreign languages. In Francophone Muslim world, like Morocco and Tunisia, people are fluent in French. In the rest of the other parts, like India, Pakistan, Malaysia, Muslims are fluent in English. And they are familiar with sciences, etc., but they are not as well trained and educated in their religious sciences. Those who go to the religious schools, they are only trained in probably certain aspects of religious school. Not only that, there has been significant decline in the quality of religious education that is offered. So both the breadth and depth of education that is offered in Islamic schools, in madrasas and Islamic universities, really is not adequate to cope with the necessity for us in order to be able to both recover and revive Islamic sciences. When you look at the past, the Muslim scholars in the past tended to divide knowledge into two broad categories. They called it the Aqli sciences and the Naqli sciences. What they meant was that certain sciences are those sciences which require reason, which use of aql, and the other, which are naqli. It doesn't mean that you don't use reason, but you're using text. For example, if you're studying hadith literature, if you're trying to determine whether a hadith is authentic or not, or what is the meaning of this hadith, and then if you're trying to understand the Quran, you're trying to understand the meaning of the verse. So all these knowledge forms which centered around the study of text, which required focus on language, on grammar, to some extent on history, were all considered broadly as Naqli sciences. And then you have Aqli sciences, which like mathematics, for example, or jurisprudential knowledge, where we had to use reason in order to determine certain hukum, certain rules, etc. So that was the broad classification of knowledge. Muslims always understood that knowledge always came from God. God had knowledge, it is a blessing of God. But as the Muslim world became more and more sophisticated, there was a need for more development of knowledge. For example, as the Muslim empire expanded, they came into contact with other civilizations. They came into contact with the Byzantine civilization. They came into contact with the Indian and Persian civilizations, and as a result of that, they were exposed to new forms of sciences, they were exposed to new forms of information gathering, they were exposed to new forms of epistemology and even religious practices. And this interaction with other civilizations forced Muslims to answer questions which were theological in nature, which were posed to them, forced Muslims to also respond to ideas that were coming into the Muslim world from outside. For example, you may have wondered as to how, even though, like I used to wonder why we talk about Tawheed as the most important principle of God, as a unity of God, when we could be saying that there is one God. But instead of saying that, why do we emphasize that the most important principle of Islam is unity of God? And then if you realize that the reason, one of the reasons was this, that it is like a theological response to the Christian challenge of Trinity. So when Christians were presenting God as Trinity, we responded by saying it's not Trinity, but it's unity. And of course there were other challenges, saying the fact that the Quran has 99 names of God, does that mean that there are 99 dimensions of God? Are there 99 gods? Obviously not. So we had to say, no, even though these are different attributes, these are all unified in one. So in many ways, a lot of Islamic knowledge that developed was a response to inter-civilizational dialogues that were taking place in the early period. And one of the profoundest impact of this was the acquisition by Muslims of Greek philosophy and Greek science, and then Muslim response to that Greek philosophy and that Greek science, and how Muslims worked with it and how they developed it. There are some people who believe that all Muslims did were be passive conveyors of Greek knowledge. We just read Aristotle and Plato, and then we kept it as it is for 1,000 years and waited for Europe to be ready for them again and then give it back to them. It is an extremely erroneous and ignorant idea. Okay, Muslims really work with them. There are many things about Aristotle, Plato, others, which Muslims have advanced in the knowledge, they have worked with it. The Greek sciences were not really sciences, they were at the level of hypothesis. So the real observations and real empirical work that was done based on presumptions and assumptions and epistemological assumptions of Greek sciences were done by Muslim philosophers and scientists for more than 1,000 years. So in that sense, that is the biggest response. The way we can look at the plethora, like if you were to go to this buffet table and see what the Islamic civilization has intellectually to offer for you, you will find that the biggest dish, which is right in the middle of the table, is about law. The most prominent knowledge form that Muslims have developed is Islamic law, the knowledges that revolve around the Sharia. To such an extent that today, in many ways, Muslims confuse knowledge of Islam with knowledge of Islamic law. So when we talk about an alim, we only think of someone who can give you a fatwa. For example, we don't think of Muslim scholars as people who can give you philosophical answers to philosophical questions, mystical answers to mystical questions, or even questions which are connected with biology, connected with health, and so on and so forth. So it is someone who has a degree in, who's an alim, who's basically a trained lawyer. We go and pose all kinds of questions. Can you imagine when someone says, oh, I'm suffering from anxiety and I want to go to my lawyer and ask him, what is the solution? And then someone says, oh, I'm having trouble disciplining my children never listen to me. Let me go to the lawyer and ask the lawyer what to do about it. And then you say, oh my God, I have palpitations of heart and I feel that my heart is not okay. Let me go to the lawyer. That's exactly what the Muslim world does today, that no matter what the problem is, they go to the alim who actually happens to be a trained lawyer. There are very few societies really, and I was very impressed with Turkey, where I actually found trained mutakallimun, people who say that their training is in Kalam and they are advocates of Kalam and they're historians of Kalam. I don't meet people like that anywhere in South Asia or for that matter in the Arab world. So the Muslim world today remains completely dominated by Islamic law and the study of Islamic law, to such an extent that Muslims equate religion with law, religious scholarship with legal scholarship, and religious scholars with legal scholars to a great extent. So what is this legal tradition? You can look at it in many ways. The easiest way to look at it is to divide it into two streams. Okay? But before that, let me tell you that the Islamic legal tradition is not all what you think it is, which is the sense that it's not all divine. What we call Islamic legal tradition includes many things which have no sacred basis for them. Part of it is urf of the Arabs, the local customs which have become part of religion. If there was nothing explicitly un-Islamic about a local tradition, we simply embraced it for convenience. There is nothing Islamic about driving on the right side of the road or left side of the road. Okay? Accounting practices, computer programming, there's nothing Islamic or un-Islamic about some of these practices. We adopted and embraced them because they were part of conventions, etc. So Islamic legal tradition, that's why I use the word Islamic legal tradition to tell you that there are many things that come under the rubric of Islamic law which are not necessarily coming out of Islamic sources. But very broadly, we should look at it as composed of two things. Number one, Islamic law has a discipline called usul al-fiqh, and the other is fiqh. These are the two broad dishes that come out of the main dish called Islamic law. Usul al-fiqh is jurisprudence, whereas fiqh is essentially a compendium of laws and rules. So for example, if you say, what should I do if I miss my fast? Then you can go to an Islamic legal scholar, and depending on which religious school you follow, the madhab, he will give you an answer. You just open a book. There is a book there, down there, which says the fiqh of worship. You can see that, right? So fiqh of worship, what should I do if I make a mistake in my prayer? So depending on what legal school you follow, he will just look up a book and give you an answer. That collection of these rules is called fiqh. But how did we arrive at these rules? How do we reach these conclusions? That is usul al-fiqh. That is how we extract laws. God did not send us a book which is a book of laws alone. The Quran is a guidance to those who believe, and according to many Islamic legal scholars, of the 6,237 verses that are there in the Quran, maybe only 600 of them are legal verses. They are called ayat al-ahkam. The rest are not ahkam related. So how do we know which are legal verses and which are not legal verses, and how do we draw this? So all of that falls in the philosophical discussion of what is law, what constitutes law, what is evidence, and how do we extract it. For example, you must have heard a lot about hudud punishments. Hudud punishment, we should cut people's hands off if they're caught committing theft. So what is hudud? What is the hudud punishment? What is the definition of that punishment? How do we know that this particular crime falls under hudud law and that particular crime does not? The answer is very simple, because then you have to go to the jurisprudential discussions. So you go to usul al-fiqh, and there you will find the discussion that hudud punishments are those punishments where the crime, the punishment, and the procedure of how to prosecute that crime, all three are found in the Quran. If the crime, the punishment, and the procedure on how to prosecute that. So for example, if you're looking at adultery, the crime is identified in the Quran. The punishment is identified in the Quran. And the fact that 4 witnesses should be produced in order to punish that crime is also provided. So that is the hudud punishment. We know that lying is a sin, but we don't know what the punishment is. The Quran doesn't tell us what should be the punishment of a person who lies. So that's not a hudud punishment. So these kind of discussions are under jurisprudence. But the simplest way in which we can understand usul al-fiqh is to say what usul al-fiqh does is to identify what are the sources of Islamic law and how to extract Islamic law from these sources of Islamic law. So what are the masadir, or the sources of Islamic law? So basically we have two primary sources, which is the Quran and the Sunnah. And beyond the Quran and the Sunnah, there are other sources. For example, the ijma of the Sahaba, the ijma of the companions. Number 4 is ijtihad, maslaha, mursala, darura, necessity. All of these are sources of Islamic law. Now, different schools accept different sources of Islamic law. Even though most schools accept ijtihad, the way you do ijtihad is different. So the clusters of philosophical assumptions and conclusions which are drawn in the usul al-fiqh literature, which is jurisprudential literature, they make what we call today are the different madhab. Like today in the Sunnis, we recognize 4 major schools, which is the Hanafis, the Shafis, the Malikis, and Hanbalis. And they vary in their fiqh, obviously, in some cases, but the fiqh is different because their usul is different. Okay? They have different conceptions. For example, to a great extent, the Hanafis privilege rational thought. They will call for a long time Ahl al-Rai, people of opinion, because they said, oh my God, they allow their personal opinions to influence the way they interpret Islamic sources in order to extract Islamic laws. The Hanbali school is very strict. It tries to completely minimize human reason and human opinion, and is always privileging text over reason. So nas over aqal is constantly privileged. The Hanafis have come up with methods in which they do the exact opposite, where they try to balance both reason and text. So this is how we have. Today when we look at define a Sunni, in order to be a Sunni Muslim, you have to follow one of the 4 Islamic legal schools. You have to be a Hanafi, a Shafi'i, a Maliki, or a Hanbali, otherwise you are not a Sunni. But if you actually go back to early, the 2nd century of Islam, 3rd century of Islam, you'll find that there were more legal schools at that time than we think of today. In fact, I remember having a conversation with Ali Guma when he was the Grand Mufti of Egypt, and he really surprised me by saying that he had done a survey in the city of Cairo sometime in the late 1990s, and they had identified 63 different legal Islamic schools in the city of Cairo alone. So he said there are more than 60 madahib in Cairo. I said, they vary on 1 or 2 issues. He says, no, they vary in their philosophy of law. They were actually able to tabulate and list this. The Darul Ifta of Egypt did this. So we do have many prolific legal schools which may be self-consciously different or not. Nevertheless, in the past there were other big schools. Al-Dahabi had his own school, Tabari had his own school, but they were not written traditions, they were not written schools, so they disappeared. So the schools which became prominent and influential and powerful are the legal schools that were written schools. So Imam Abu Hanifa and his students wrote down the Hanafi principles and Hanafi fatwas, and so the Hanafi school preserved. So in many ways, today some of the schools which are so dominant are those which have had a long tradition. So Islamic law is a necessary knowledge. For example, you want to know what to do. I had a long conversation with students who just come to the US from the Middle East about what constitutes safar. When can you miss your fast as a traveler? If you drive to Washington, D.C., or if you go to Washington State, when does it constitute safar? A simple rule is, if you're going to make your salah qasr, you're going to shorten your prayer, then you can miss your fast. But then when do you decide? It was very interesting. I had a lot of Middle Eastern students, especially from Africa, kept saying 80 kilometers. And I said, 80 kilometers? I used to go for Jummah, which is about 50 miles when we were living in Michigan. So for me, that should have constituted travel. It doesn't. You know, I personally use 100 miles as a rough number. If I drive more than 100 miles, then I will shorten my prayers. So, but all of these are different, traditions. So law is that way very fundamentally important to all of us. But you must understand, Islam is not just law. We all need to have some basic understanding of Islamic law, day to day. If you read the book that Imam al-Ghazali wrote with regards to knowledge in his Ihya Ulumuddin, he basically writes it like saying, if you live one day, you need to know this. If you live for a week as a Muslim, you need to know this. And if you live for 1 year as a Muslim, then you need to know all of this. So it's a very interesting way. So if you live as a Muslim, there are certain things that you need to know. Okay, maybe not how to lead Salatul Janazah, but you need to know how to pray, how to fast, and so on. And there are legal rules about it. So Islamic law, in that sense, that's why people tend to sometimes confuse and think this is the real knowledge of Islam. So religion is not just about rules and regulations, but nevertheless we live in a period where Islamic legal rules dominate. Okay, so people sometimes just confuse that these days we have lots of people going and taking courses over weekends, and when I come back, they tell me they were studying Usul al-Fiqh, and I said, why are you going to become a mujtahid? Why do you want to become? It's a very strange thing. It's like, you know, when we go and do our MBA, all of us are taught to be CEOs. How many of those guys are ever going to become CEOs? They don't know how to be assistant managers on day one, right? We never teach them how to be assistant managers. So similarly, we are training people to become mujtahids when we don't teach them enough of the fiqh to operate like a regular Muslim on a day-to-day basis. I mean, what do you do suddenly when you're confronted with a situation? I mean, how do you bathe somebody if they have died in your family? That is more important than trying to understand when you can apply the rule of darura and when you cannot. But nevertheless, that is one important part of Islamic tradition. It is a living intellectual tradition because we are constantly facing new challenges. For example, the latest challenge that American Muslims face, and they are having trouble responding to it, is a Supreme Court decision on making gay marriage legal all over the United States. I'm just waiting for the United States government to employ a married gay person as ambassador to a Muslim country. Okay. Imagine if this ambassador goes to a Muslim country and buys some property and dies, and his spouse comes forward and says, I hope to claim this as this belongs to my husband. Oh, it'll be so interesting legally to watch, right? So how do we respond to this? It's a legal question, but it's not just a legal question, it's also a question of compassion. What do we do as Muslims? I mean, this about the rights of other people, and so on and so forth. So while I will be talking about other forms of Islamic knowledge, I don't want you to think that I'm saying Islamic legal information and knowledge is less important. It is very interesting and very important. And not very intellectually stimulating, honestly. Okay, it is like halal, haram, halal, haram, is this okay, is this not okay, is gummy bears all right, is it all right or not? It's like Islamic law deals with issues which are on the boundary of Muslim and non-Muslim. So it's like, you're just a Muslim, you're not a Muslim. It is at the bottommost part. You're not dealing with the higher levels of what it means to be a Muslim. I feel that Islam is a range between adl and ihsan. Islam starts with justice and goes all the way up to ihsan. So at the minimum, a Muslim should be a just person. And we understand this justice from law. You cannot deal with people unfairly or in an unjust fashion. So if you are a just person, in my opinion, you are just a Muslim. But you can become better. That's why, you know, you hear this all the time in khutbah. Inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsan. God, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He commands you to do justice with ihsan? Because justice is not enough. Law is not enough. And that is an important thing for us to understand, that we have to go from adl to ihsan. The second and more important, shall we say, the non-legal tradition that developed in the Muslim world was that of Kalam. So you have the discussions of the Sharia. A lot of people, I want to make one more comment about Sharia before I move to Kalam. A lot of people talk about Sharia as if they know what Sharia is. Like if I were to ask you what are the driving rules of the state of Delaware, I'm sure you can direct me to the website where all the rules are given. Sharia is not like that. And in one of my introductory classes, students called and asked me, Dr. Khan, where is Sharia? I said, it's on a wall in my house. And I showed them the picture of my bookshelves. And so they're looking for a book called Sharia. I said, see, that's the thing. Sharia is this abstract idea. It is divine law. It is enshrined in the Quran. It is also there in the Hadith tradition. It is also in the previous religious traditions. And what we do as human beings is that there is an interaction between religious sacred sources and human intellect. And after the interaction of the two, we produce something and we say, in my opinion, and that's what everyone should say actually. They shouldn't say this is Sharia ruling. They should say, in my opinion, this is a Sharia ruling. And that becomes fiqh. So the Hanafis will say, in our understanding, this is a Sharia ruling. In our understanding, it is important that Muslims migrate to foreign lands and go as far as possible and become ambassadors of Islam. And the Malikis will come and say, in our understanding of the Sharia, Muslims, if they find themselves as minorities, should immediately migrate from minority places and go back to the Muslim world, where they can live freely and practice their faith. Entirely opposite positions, the Hanafis and Malikis. But they're extracting rules and fiqh and explanation from the same abstract idea of Sharia. So Sharia is a divine thing, but the moment we start articulating it, it becomes a product of divine sources and human reason. And that is what fiqh is. That's why fiqh can change. So when we talk about it, never say Islam says this. First of all, there's no, Islam doesn't speak. We speak on behalf of Islam. And so you should say, in my opinion. Or actually quote somebody whose opinion you are citing and say, well, so-and-so scholar said that this is what is the opinion of Islam. Fine. Then you can look at his sources and we can agree or disagree. That's why we had the spirit of Wallahu Alam. Every time when Muslims made any claim, they said, Wallahu Alam. God knows best. What it really means is, I think I am right and I think you are wrong, but it's quite possible that you are right and I am wrong. That's what Wallahu Alam means. I think I'm right and you're wrong, but however, it's possible that you're right and I'm wrong. That's what we mean when we say Wallahu Alam. Now, as Muslims interacted with other people, people started asking questions. Scholars of other religions started asking Muslims all kinds of questions about the authenticity of the Quran, about God. I'm sure you must have met people stopping on and said, what can Muhammad do for you? Jesus is your savior. He's already died for your sins. Just acknowledge it and you're done. How do you respond to that? So when early Muslim scholars started meeting this, they felt the need to talk about religion to somebody who does not necessarily believe in the religion. So how do you interact with people who do not believe in your beliefs? How do you have a dialogue with someone who's not part of the regime of truth? Like for example, if I'm arguing with a Muslim, all I have to do is pull out my iPhone, take out the Quran and show him the ayah and that's it. The debate is over, right? Unless he wants to further dispute the interpretation of the ayah. We can produce a hadith and oftentimes that settles it. But you show that to a non-Muslim and he says, what's that? He doesn't accept the authenticity of the Quran and hadith, he doesn't even know what it is, and it's not going to carry any weight. So what happens in that dialogue is that you have to produce rational proofs. You're having an argument with an atheist. You can't tell him the Quran says God exists and He's one, and you're expecting to believe it. You'll have to provide rational or empirical proofs. So when Muslims found themselves in that situation where they felt the need, now this is not a unique situation for Muslims alone. All scholars of all religious communities have felt the need to provide a rational explanation of religion. And that attempt to provide a rational explanation of religion is what we call today as kalam. It became theology. Theology is a rational attempt to explain religion. So Muslims also produced the tradition of kalam. But what has happened with kalam is once they got into this phase and then reason is a very powerful vehicle. Once you get on the bus, you can't get off it, and it works in both ways. So not only were Muslims beginning to do this, for example, it led to lots of serious internal debates within Muslims. For example, the Kharijites, who were very upset with them, started calling Imam Ali as non-Muslim and wanted to kill him, and they went ahead and killed him. So their whole argument was, anybody who commits a big sin is a kafir. And you should kill a kafir because he was a Muslim, he became a kafir, he became an apostate, so you kill him. So there were people trying to say, wait a minute, if you commit a big sin, it does not necessarily mean that you become a kafir. You know, how do you explain this position? So the Mu'tazila came up, became a group which started talking about manzilatain. They said that there is a position between these two positions of being a believer and a non-believer. There is a third position where you are still a believer and committing serious sins, etc. So they were responding to certain theological challenges from real life world. But others began to disagree. So Kalam suddenly became an internal Muslim debate. Then Muslims have started arguing about, the most important argument is the extent to which we should use reason, the extent to which we should use aql, and what is the significance of aql. So there are broadly 5 schools of Kalam. Number 1 is the Ash'ari Kalam, the number 2 is the Maturidis, number 3 is the Mu'tazila, and then you have 2 Shia Kalam traditions, Imami and Marja'iyya. I don't know much about those 2 traditions. But the Sunnis have these 3 traditions, and there is the traditional position, which goes back to the period of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, etc., which did not believe in the use of reason. For them, text was all that was important. You use the Quran or the Hadith, that's it. You don't use aql to explain things. So the biggest differences, like for example, the Ash'aris use reason in a limited fashion. So did the Maturidis. But the Mu'tazilis use reason completely. They argued that reason was fully capable of defining what is morality for us. But both the Ash'aris and the Maturidis believe that revelation is necessary for defining what is morality for us. For example, you and I can probably use a reason to define what, like I don't need a word from the Quran to tell you that waterboarding somebody is torture. Waterboarding somebody is torture. It's pretty obvious. Torture is clearly apparent. It doesn't even need arguments to be identified as an immoral act. But there are certain things that we consider are morally good things, like Laylatul Qadr. I mean, how can you discover Laylatul Qadr using your aql? It's impossible to come up with that. It has to be a revelation. God has to tell you that there is such a night, and it is worth 1,000 months. So that is something that comes. So the Ash'ari will point to things like this to say, no, revelation is necessary to identify what is good in morality. But the Mu'tazilites will turn around and say, no, reason is enough. If we don't understand something, we cannot act upon it. And if we cannot act on it, and so they will use other things to justify the use of aql. In Kalam, there are 2 debates which are very, very prominent, which have shaped in many ways how Muslims think of Islam today. The first debate was the debate between free will and predestination, between the Qadariyas and the Jabaris. Some people argued that the traditional Muslim position is that we don't have free will. So in order to be a Muslim, you have to believe in 6 things, which is part of your Iman. You have to believe in one God, you have to believe in His prophets, you have to believe in the Day of Judgment, you have to believe in His books and His angels, and you have to believe in Qadr. Okay, the Hadith of Ihsan, the Hadith of Jibreel clearly identify these 6 qualities. And there are enough verses in the Quran which says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Qadir and He determines our future. And that's what Laylatul Qadr is also about, because our future is written on that night we pray. So, but the Mu'tazilas try to argue that, he said, look, there is no point of having a day of judgment where you test a person for their moral choices. Like you cannot punish a person for making a moral choice which has already been determined by God. Like for example, if you have an opportunity to steal $10,000, you choose to steal it or you choose not to steal it. If you have made the choice to steal it and it is the wrong choice, God can justifiably punish you for that crime. However, if God had already determined that you will steal that money, then what's the point of punishing? Because you stole it because God wanted you to steal. So the Mu'tazilites started arguing that God is by definition just God. And a just God, in order to provide justice, must give people freedom of choice. So we should have free will. If you don't have free will, there cannot be justice on the day of judgment. Now, having that free will freaked out the traditional Muslims and they responded. And the Ash'ari school of thought essentially emerged as a response to this debate. The Ash'ari believe that God created every moment in time and every atom in space. So since God is a producer of action, we have a choice, but God creates it. In the Ash'ari minds, they have resolved it, but if you look at the debates even today, you can recognize that it is not fully resolved. Look, I don't have the freedom of choice to be born in the 20th century, or to be born a male, or to be born in India. You know, I have no choice when I will die. So there are lots of things we have no free will about, and our social structures are so complicated that even the decisions that we make politically, religiously, are not socially, we don't know whether they're free will or pure pressure. Forget about determinism by God himself. Sometimes some of our actions are determined by our social customs. So the issue of free will remains nebulous, and that is where Kalam emerges. The second major debate, which the Mutakallimun, as they are called, people who engage in Kalam, is about the Quran, whether it was created or whether it is uncreated. Well, it's a very interesting debate. When I was reading the debate, at first I found it, what's the point of this conversation? What are you arguing over? Because the mainstream orthodox position is that the Quran is uncreated. So I'm reading the Quran now and I'm saying if this is uncreated, then it becomes co-eternal with God, right? So the Mu'tazilas are saying, if Quran is uncreated, then it exists since eternity with God and will exist in eternity with God. So we have two things that exist, God and Quran simultaneously. So this compromises monotheism. That's why the first principle of Mu'tazilas is Tawheed and the second principle is justice, Adl. This is what they meant by Tawheed, saying that God is alone. He existed alone. Nothing else existed prior to him. He is the only one which existed from eternity. Therefore, Quran is God's creation. And the eternal people say, wait a minute, in the traditional position, and I'll tell you what the logic of their argument. So when I look, like for example, we have the surah, Tabbat Yada Abi Lahabin wa Tabas. Okay, the surah has the name of Abu Lahab in it. So now are we saying that the name of Abu Lahab coexisted with God from eternity till the end of eternity? It's kind of weird, right, to see how such an elevated status for Abu Lahab. But what the traditionalist position is, Ash'ari position is that the Quran, if you look at it as a book, then maybe you can argue that it has been created by God. But if Quran is speech of God, then it has to be co-eternal. You cannot separate God from his attributes. God is merciful. So mercy of God coexisted with God from eternity and will exist with God till eternity. So think of me, like I have a nose and it existed as long as I existed. You can't separate me from my nose. It's part of me. And so is my speech. So God could always speak. Even if he didn't speak for a long time, he could always speak. So Quran, as long as it is the speech of God, is co-eternal. It makes perfect sense from the tradition. So if you think of Quran as speech of God, obviously it is part of God. There are no two things. God and God's speech are not two different things. So it does not compromise Tawheed. But the Mu'tazilas thought of Quran as a book, as a created book entity. So they did not think it. How can it coexist? So this is another debate. So these debates exist. So today, technically, if you were to believe that the Quran is not created, If you believe that Quran is created and not co-eternal, then you are not a Sunni Muslim. This is supposed to be part of your aqidah. How many of us have really been taught this? I don't know. I learned about it in my 30s when I was doing my dissertation, and reading about the debates between free will and determination. I also read other debates between the Kalam, and I found this very interesting. But nevertheless, that is how Kalam developed and stuff. People don't like mutakallimun, the traditional scholars. In fact, Imam Shafi'i said that we need mutakallimun in order to provide rational explanation. They provided rational proofs of God's existence, they provided rational proofs of prophecy, they provided rational proofs of the need for prophecy. So they provide, intellectually speaking, they provide an important goal, but Imam Shafi'i says that the ordinary masses should be protected from kalam. It's only some very specific scholars should be studied. There is this very interesting story about Imam Abu Hanifa, who started his early career as a mutakallimun. He was a great debater, he used to go around debating. One day a woman came and asked him a question. I think it was a question, I don't remember what the question was. It was a question about iddah. She came to Imam Abu Hanifa's house and she asked him the question about iddah. In his time, in his city, there used to be a scholar of Islamic law. Imam Abu Hanifa was like this Muslim star out there. Everyone used to go to listen. He used to debate in public. He was a great debater and he was very famous. So when this woman asked him this question, he was totally stumped. He didn't know what it was. The mutakallimun, some of them in their extremism had become so full of themselves that they thought that just because they were experts in Kalam, they didn't need to pray 5 times. So they didn't know many things of day-to-day Islam, but they knew how to argue about the rationality of the soul and provide proofs of God's existence, etc. So Imam Abu Hanifa listened to that woman, thought for a moment, and he got up and he said, I have wasted my whole life, and he walked off. He went straight to the scholar who taught law and sat down and said, from today I'm your student, and that's how he then became a scholar of Islamic jurisprudence and Mujtahid. So this is Kalam. In Western sciences, we still have Kalam, is still very much alive. They call it theology, the handmaiden of philosophy, it's a rational approach to religion. And I think the evolution and development of theology was very important for enlightenment. Like today when we study Western philosophers like Descartes and Kant, etc., we study them from a very secular perspective, but they were not secular scholars. They were very well informed by religious thinking. So theology in the Western tradition became more and more rational. So it is very close to philosophy, theology, and I think that Muslims should go back and not be engaged in the debates. Like we should not approach Kalam in order to fight over whether the Quran is created or uncreated today and divide our masajid, etc. But we need to acquire the tradition of Kalam to come and talk about, what to do in a secular society when there are people living in different religions, and how do we bring religious values to the public sphere. How do we go and make an argument to Hindus and to atheists and Buddhists that a particular Islamic value is good for public policy? How do we translate this religious principle into a rational principle? And that is what Kalam can be very useful today. So we can go back. Like for example, there is enough empirical evidence to suggest that segregated classrooms and gender segregation may be good for both of them. That both men and boys and girls do well when they are separated in classrooms. There is that data available, and that for those Muslims who believe that there should be gender segregation in school, if they were to go out in a public forum and just quote a hadith or an ayah, it's not going to work. But they can make rational arguments and they can learn. So that's why Kalam is an important part. It allows people to transcend their fundamental assumptions about faith to be able to make an argument. But the story of Kalam starts with the reason, with aql, with the importance of reason. For some reason, Muslim orthodoxy is afraid of reason, is afraid of logic, is afraid of science. They try to minimize. They think it is human opinion. What they don't realize is that is also a human opinion. The fear of reason is also a human opinion. But nevertheless, the fear of kalam was because of the use of reason, especially the way the Mu'tazila did. There's also a little bit of political, that Mu'tazila's position that the Quran is a created thing became used as a political litmus test by certain caliphs. And they oppressed a lot of traditional Muslim scholars, including Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal was put in jail because he refused to believe that the Quran was created. He said no, so they locked him up. So unfortunately, in the Islamic history, freedom of speech and thought was violated by rationalists and not traditionalists in the first instance. Okay? Today, the traditionalists are the ones who violate freedom of thought and conscience, etc. But the tradition started with the rationalists. It's the rationalists who use the power of the state to force their religious beliefs. They used to do, it's called the man, they used to do such horrible thing where the caliph would interrogate a person about his beliefs, especially about the createdness of the Quran or not, and if you took a position which was against the official position of the government, you were stripped of your jobs, your positions, and sent to prison. So unfortunately, the Mutakallimun have a dark side to their history, especially the Mu'tazila on this issue, where they try to force their... It tells me that anybody who really believes in the power of reason will not use force as a substitute of reason. You know the ayah in the Quran says, La ikraha fid din. People quote the first part of the ayah, but the second part is also very deep. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that there is no compulsion in religion because truth is so clear from falsehood. And that is the job of reason, is to clarify things. If you can't clarify things, you don't shove a pistol into somebody else. I feel, okay, so logic doesn't work, the bullet might. And that is oppression. But this response, this engagement with Greek philosophy, Greek logic, also led to interesting development, which is the budding of sciences in the Muslim world, and also the budding of philosophy. One of the most ironic things about contemporary Muslims are, they're so proud of the golden age of Islam. Say, oh, Muslims are so great, Muslims invented the camera, Muslims invented algebra, Muslims invented everything, you know. We just didn't market it well. So Muslims did this. But what they won't tell you is that those scientists were also philosophers. None of these Muslim scientists were hardcore Islamic legal scholars. You don't have people who are talking about bid'ah, going around and coming up with inventions. So we have to be very clear what we mean by golden age. If we mean by golden age the period of Khulafa Rashidin, then be very clear about it. But if you mean by the golden age, a period of civil war and questions of legitimacy, I don't know on what grounds do we say it's a golden age? There was a crisis of legitimacy. Authority had collapsed, at least in the last two caliphs period. So when we say golden age and we talk about science, then we should value that science. And we should value the philosophy that went together. All Islamic scientists, more or less, were philosophers. And I'll tell you why. The most important thing for science, and there are some people here, students of sciences, is you have to believe in causality. If you don't believe in causality, there is no science. Period. Like there are doctors, I'm sure you believe that this causes that. Otherwise you can't treat the cause. You can't say that, oh, if this happens, maybe this also happens. They're not associative. They don't occur simultaneously. There is a causal relationship. Sometimes we can show causal relationships and sometimes you cannot, but in science you have to. That's why you're so sure when you sit in a car and drive at 100 miles, you know the brake is going to work. When you sit in planes, every time when we fly and we do this, we perform surgery, we are taking shahada in causality and science, that this thing works, right? All Sunni mainstream mutakallimun attacked causality and denied causality. So Asharis do not believe in causality. Maturidis, they believe more than Asharis. The Mu'tazilas believe in causality. The philosophers believe in causality. But all Orthodox Muslims do not believe in causality. They believe in something that is called occasionalism. If you don't believe in causality, science is out of the window. Then people start saying silly things like, if you allow women to drive, we will have more homosexuals in society. When I read this fatwa from a Saudi scholar, I was baffled, because he was using causality, which is forbidden by his own kalam or his anti-kalam position, right? You can't make causal arguments like that if you are especially from the Hanbali school of thought. Well, this is an important part to remember. If you want to understand why we talk about the golden age and its decline, is this belief. Even today, we have so many Muslim medical doctors, when they take exam, they believe in evolution. When they enter the masjid, they do not believe in evolution. That's why they are not doing any research. They may make a lot of money by practicing, but they're not contributing to the development of science. We probably have in this tiny Delaware, what, 500 doctors maybe? But how many people who are doing scientific research in medicine? You have to believe in science to become a scientist, as period. That is as simple as that. If you really believe in science and then you come across a puzzle, then you puzzle over it, it agonizes you. Talk to people. I'm blessed, I live among thousands of scientists at the university, and I have fascinating conversations with them as to how they deal with puzzles. Even Muslim scientists who deal with it. And it's interesting as to how their mind latches onto that problem and eventually they figure it out. You know? And all of it is, what causes this? What causes this? Well, I need to find out what causes AIDS. What causes it? And that's when you find the cure. This is an important thing. So Islamic philosophy, it was attacked because of its belief in causality. It creates a lot of problems. This whole assumption that God creates everything is a problem for this theological position, for scientific position. Muslims very profoundly say this thing that, oh, there is no problem in science and religion, it is a Western problem. No, it's a problem with all religions. Muslims also had a problem with science. It's just that the Muslim world was sufficiently free for scientists to thrive at the same time. Okay? So there were scientists and philosophers who were going around, nobody was grabbing them and killing them, even though the mainstream people disagreed with them. Today what has happened in the Muslim world is the civil society has become very weak. Like look at Delaware Muslim, all we have is masjids. We have nothing outside the masjid. But in Israel, like in the United States, there are people who can live their entire life spiritually and intellectually, vigorously, without ever going to church. Because there is so much of institutions outside the church also where they can be satisfied spiritually and intellectually. And the universities here are incredible. I mean, you go to a university, I believe it will satisfy all your needs, an American need from spiritual to intellectual to history to science, etc. So in the Muslim world too, in the past, you had people who were theologians, who were orthodox, but you also had philosophers, and also you had scientists who did. Ibn Sina famously tasted his own urine and described the taste of urine. Can you imagine the fatwas that will have come his way? So the philosophers believed in reason. This is important. The only difference between Muslim philosophers and the Greek philosophers were that nearly all Muslim philosophers accepted God, so they were not really atheistic, and also accepted the importance of prophecy. Ibn Rushd wrote this famous thing called the double. He thought that there were two pathways to truth. One was through reason and the other was through revelation. Revelation was shortcut. The teacher of Ibn Rushd, or he's called, some people say teacher, Ibn Tufail wrote a fabulous book called Hay Ibn Yaqzan. How many of you have read Robinson Crusoe? You know the story of Robinson Crusoe, right? Some of you. Yeah, Robinson Crusoe is this guy who's marooned on an island, and the whole story is about how he lives on that island alone until another person comes. He lives on the island alone, and his problems are how to make a table, how to make a tent, how to make this, how to make a boat, how to accept this, etc., etc. And then finally, Another guy gets marooned. Do you know what the guy's name is? Man Friday. That's why they call Man Friday comes and Man Friday teaches him other things. Well, 200 or 300, this was written in the 15th or 16th. This is the first English novel. Robinson Crusoe is the first English novel written by a guy called Daniel Defoe, who also wrote another interesting book called God is an Englishman. But that's a different story. Several hundred years before Robinson Crusoe was written, Hayy bin Yaqzan was written. Hayy bin Yaqzan is also the story of a person who gets marooned alone on an island, a little child who is nursed by an antelope and grows up. And then when the antelope dies, this little boy performs an autopsy on his mother to figure out why she died. It's a fascinating story. And then many years later, he rescues another person called Juma. And he comes to his island and he teaches him Arabic. The first thing he does is teaches Hayy ibn Yaqzan, who's lived as a savage alone, teaches him Arabic. And after he teaches him Arabic, now he starts teaching him Islam. And every time this person tells Hayy something profound, which is existential or from the Quran or the Hadith, Hayy's response is, I know. And this man gets really frustrated. How can you know when I found out you were a savage, you couldn't even speak a language, you were not even human, I taught you, and how can you know? So Hayy explains in his, that is where the philosopher is explaining how reason can reach the same truths that revelation did. It is such a tragedy that Muslims today, millions of us, go through life reading Robinson Crusoe, which is a silly book. It is an explanation of materialism. All of Robinson Crusoe's problems are materialistic. How do I make a table? How do I make a bookshelf? Whereas Hayy bin Yaqzan's all questions are philosophical and mystical. Who am I? Where did I come from? Who is my mother? Why did she die? What is death? So you can see the change in not just from Muslim to West. It's like, what is modernity? Modernity is about superficial material things. And none of us in our lives get an opportunity there. You should go and buy the book. It's now, many translations are available in English of Hayy ibn Yaqzan. It's a small book. But that was Ibn Rushd, the student. So Ibn Rushd, following his teacher, Ibn Tufail, wrote this fabulous argument in Fasl al-Maqal that we can find truth both through reason and through revelation. They try to reconcile religion and revelation in their work. This was an important part of Islamic philosophers. But Islamic philosophers also did something very interesting. Someone told me that they used Plato in one hand and kept people distracting while they hid Aristotle. Okay. The real philosopher was Aristotle. They liked him more. That's why when you say Al-Farabi is the second scholar, second teacher, the first teacher is Aristotle. And they knew that Aristotle would freak out the religious people because of causality and because of science. Plato was not a scientist, he was a rationalist. Aristotle was a scientist who went from empirical to truth, from material world to the world of ideas. Plato came from the world of ideas and tried to apply it to real world. So Plato is something acceptable to the traditional religious legal scholars. Aristotle is not. Without Aristotle, you cannot have science. And that's what they were constantly protecting, and that's what Ghazali freaked out, and he said, what? And he wrote this fabulous, actually he wrote a two-part book. First he wrote Maqasid al-Falasifa, the purposes of philosophy. He summarized what the philosophers were doing, and then he wrote a second book called Tahafat al-Falasifa, the incoherence of philosophy, basically attacking Aristotle. Over 100 years later, Ibn Rushd comes back and writes another book called Tahafat al-Tahafat, the incoherence of incoherence, and basically destroys Ghazali's arguments. I bought both books, but when I bought the second one, Tahafat al-Tahafat, I realized that I should not have bought the first one. Because the way Ibn Rushd responds to Ghazali is, he says, this is what Ghazali says, this is what I say, this is what Ghazali says, this is what I say, point by point. The whole book is, so Ghazali's book is entirely contained in Ibn Rushd's book. And this debate lasted. There were at least 5 books which came with this. When Ibn Rushd Tahafat al-Tahafat, someone came back and defended Ghazali and wrote Tahafat al-Tahafat al-Tahafat. And then someone else came back and attacked him and defended Rushd and wrote Tahafat al-Tahafat. There are up to 5 levels. So there was intellectual debates going on. This was science, no. But you must also realize that Ibn Rushd's books were burnt. And traditional scholars. So that was also going on while we admire philosophy, etc. And Ibn Rushd was a very special philosopher because he was also a very important Maliki judge and also a scholar of Maliki fiqh, unlike Farabi and Ibn Sina and other philosophers. So the philosophers try to use reason to understand the purpose of life, try to explain what is the purpose of life. Farabi argued that the ultimate purpose of life is happiness, and we can know happiness only through making connections with the divine. The purpose of society is to create a society where people and citizens can be virtuous and happy. So his book, very important book that Farabi wrote called Madinat al-Fadila. And I'm currently reading the book, and I'm so amazed. He describes political integration at 3 levels. Farabi was, in my opinion, the first philosopher to talk about globalization and the possibility of global governance. He said that we can have it at the level of the global, but he prefers governance at the level of the city, and so writes about Madinat al-Fadila, the opinions of the people of the virtuous city, how to have a virtuous society, and how to develop virtuous people. Some of the broad themes that Islamic philosophers talked about was methods of reason, methods of thinking. Their concept of God was thought, thinking about thought. They didn't think that God could be material, it's just thought. So there are lots of interesting things to learn. Today you may agree to it, today you do not. I find Al-Farabi's political philosophy very compelling, very moving, and I still think he was the first Muslim political thinker to talk about democracy. This is what Farabi said about democracy. He said in a democracy, because democracy is a free society, this is what he said, because in a democracy people are free. People are free to become virtuous and people are free to become vile. So he said it depends on who prevails. If the virtuous prevail, then democracy, hedonism, etc. But what is interesting is a very systematic discussion of the virtues of democracy and its applicability. And what I like is that he did think that so I argue that this utopian Islamic society that we envision, we can approach it through a democracy, and to me the authority would be Farabi. And all of these things, Ibn Sina was not only a prominent philosopher, but also a prominent doctor. In his book on Kulliyat, on medicine, was taught until the 18th century in Europe, or nearly 600-700 years after he died. Ibn Sina, many of the surgical instruments that we use today in medicine were designed by Ibn Sina. But Ibn Sina was interesting. Like Al-Farabi was a musician, a mathematician, and a philosopher. Ibn Sina was a doctor, a philosopher, and a mystic. He was also a Sufi. Ibn Rushd was a philosopher and a lawyer, and also a physician. So science and philosophy went together. Today, what has happened in the Muslim world is a contemporary Muslim philosopher called Abdul Karim Surush. I had this wonderful opportunity when I was in graduate school to spend a couple of days with him, basically as his chauffeur, driving him around DC. And he explained to me something very interesting. He said, imagine modernity as a tree. So modernity has its fruits, and modernity has its roots. So the iPhone is computer technology, the Ferraris, the cars, are all these wonderful things, the healthcare system, vacations, globalization, all of these are the fruits of modernity. But the roots of modernity, he argued, were secularism, democracy, scientific approach, rational thought. He said the problem with Muslims today is they are consumers of the fruits of democracy, but they hate the roots, or not democracy, the fruits of modernity, but they hate the roots of modernity. Everyone is carrying an iPhone. We are consumers of modern science, but we don't like the principles of that very science. And that is a problem for us because we have killed philosophy. Nobody stopped philosophy. If you say you study philosophy, they think you're straight from the straight path. We are against using reason. We don't train. When our children ask logical questions about religion, we shut them up rather than we try. Because the moment you try to answer, the first thing you realize is how stupid and ignorant you yourself are. You don't know your tradition. You cannot answer the question. And if you cannot answer the question, rather than telling your kid, you know what, let's find it out, you smack the kid and say, don't ask him these questions. So kids are, curiosity is killed instantly. So I think one of the important, I am convinced that this so-called Islamic revival is not going to work without the revival of Islamic sciences and Islamic philosophy, unless Muslims are intellectually free and intellectually daring to ask the most difficult questions about the most fundamental assumptions that we make about life and society and God and religion, we will not progress. And I don't understand, why are we afraid? If there is a God, then why isn't the God's argument necessarily more powerful than the arguments of any human being? Why are we so worried that our religious tradition is so fragile that it will collapse at the first use of reason by a child? We just are so ready to kill somebody who asks a question which is slightly different. So that is something very important, and there cannot be an intellectual revival unless we go back and re-question these issues or reopen the debates that have actually not been shut through conclusive argument, but have been shut down through force. So it's creating some kind of a strange dichotomy, you know. I sometimes say jokingly that I know where Muslim people's brains are. They're in their shoes. So when they come to masjid, they leave their brains out. The reason is outside. So the masjid becomes a realm without reason. And the lack of that translates it. For example, even simple things like governance of masjid, governance of community, cannot do without the use of social science. And social science, the most fundamental assumption of social science is finding truths based on empirical data. What would you do if you find that in your city, gay people are better parents than natural parents? You have data after data showing, what will you do? You tell the social scientists you're dead, shoot the scientists, or shut down the school that does that research. Because you can't adjust, you don't know how to cope with that reality. So we don't want to do empirical research, because we don't want to find things which will make us forced to rethink our position. So there is hardly any social science. People have all kinds of opinions which are never tested. They're never tested empirically. You think you have a great theory about whatever is good, try it out. And that this empirical part is where philosophy is, where science is, and social sciences. I have had the privilege of having an entire khutbah dedicated to attacking me. It was based on an article I wrote for Islamic Horizon, in which I said it's important for Muslims also to have social sciences. Islamic sciences tell you where we need to go morally and ethically. Islamic sciences don't tell you where you are today. You need social sciences to find out where you are. Then only can you chart a path to where you have to go. They can give you a moral vision, but they cannot tell you where. Imam Abu Hanifa can tell us where we should be, but he can't tell us where American Muslims are today. You need empirical data. Like, once this course started, I was so puzzled that after living 7-8 years in this city, in this state, and interacting with lots of people in this city for many years, I really have very little knowledge about what motivates them. You understand? I couldn't understand what motivates their behavior because I've never studied them scientifically. I'm working with a good Muslim model in my head, which doesn't seem to work. So that's an important point. So today in the contemporary Muslim society, we need to have social science. There are some efforts made. There's this project that's actually launched in the United States called the Association of Muslim Social Scientists. And we have a journal called the American Journal of Islamic Social Sciences. I was the president of this association for a couple of years. And they're trying to do things like that, produce Islamic psychology. To give you one example, in Malaysia, there are places where drug addiction and alcohol addiction is treated by Muslim psychologists who use findings in the field of psychology and from Islamic values and from Islamic Sufism and integrated them to provide much better holistic treatment of addicts than regular medical practices. Here, even in the US, we find that to a great extent on addiction, etc. People don't know this, but the AA program is a religious initiative. Comes from a spiritual initiative, not from a scientific conclusion. Alcohol Anonymous is like a religious initiative. So coming down to so we have scientific and legal knowledge composed of fiqh and usul fiqh. Then we have theology called kalam with different schools of thought. Then we have philosophy is science. And then another important science is ilm tasawwuf, the knowledge of spirituality. Now, how do we know what is it? There are some people who actually, I've been researching this field in the last 2-3 years. There are some Muslim scholars who actually deny that there is such a thing as ilm tasawwuf. Quite shocking to me. The first time I was shocked, now I'm nearly amused by that. But what is ilm tasawwuf? There is one way to look at it is to realize that there is the world that you see, the zahir, and then there is the world that you don't see, the world that is unseen. The knowledge of the seen world is where you have all of this science, law, philosophy, history, etc. When you go into the world of the unseen, that is where the knowledge of spirituality comes in. The knowledge of spirituality comes in. Like a few days ago, I was talking about various levels of fasting. Fasting of the senses, fasting of the appetites, fasting of the mind, and fasting of the heart. So how do we conclude what is fasting of the heart? This is where ilm tasawwuf comes. The law will teach you what you need to do, but how you need to do that is a process. Like, for example, one of the things that we keep telling people in this month of Ramadan is to purify your soul. And how will you purify your soul? In order to purify your soul, first you need to know what are the ailments of the soul. What are the diseases of the heart? What are the spiritual diseases of the heart? You can go to the cardiologist and he'll tell you what are the physical diseases of the heart, but what are the spiritual? There are jealousy, anger. I have a cousin who used to tell me when he was young, he was so conscious about certain aspects of his body that he could not pray if good-looking men who were thin were standing next to him. He was so embarrassed that he was fat that he said that my prayer used to get distracted. So he would come late to the mosque and stay and pray in the last row because then he doesn't have to think of these thin people standing next to him. Now that is an element of the heart. I mean, you could call it a psychological condition too. But there are things like envy, there are things like jealousy. How do you treat these things? How do you work these things out? But more profoundly, the fear of the uncertainty of the life of the hereafter. Just as the philosopher will tell you that the purpose of life is happiness, and he defines happiness as acquisition of knowledge. A scholar of Tasawwuf will tell you that the purpose of life is to go back to God, is to come closer to God. Now, if you look at religion, religion promises a lot of things, that there is a God, and then there is all of these rewards. But if you want a taste of it in this life, how do you get it? How do you experience God in this life? You know, Muslim scholars have talked about certainty, yaqeen, in many ways. They say one is ilm al-yaqeen. I mean, how do you know that God sent prophets? You know that God sent prophets because the Quran says so. But there is another thing called ayn al-yaqeen. How do you know that there are masajid in Delaware? Well, we visited them. But then how do you know that there is compassion among Muslims of Delaware? If you've experienced it, you know it, right? So it's haqqan yaqeen, it's through experience. So similarly, how do you know that there is a God? Because the Quran says so. And how do you know the Quran is the work of God? Because the Quran says so. I mean, it's like a tautological argument. So one way in which people who have sought to experience God in this world are those who have pursued tasawwuf. There are many ways in which you can cut it. Pursuit of perfection of the soul, the pursuit of experience of God in this world. And there are many hadiths, so the most profoundest of traditions which suppose tasawwuf is the hadith where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that is, my servant comes closer to me by fulfilling the requirements, but also doing the nawafil. The more nawafil you fulfill, the closer he comes to me. The closer he comes to me, the more I love him. And when I love him, he looks at the world through my eyes, he walks on this earth through my legs, and so on and so forth. So the idea of union with God is there in many traditions. In the Quran also God says, I'm closer to you than you judge away, and I am with you wherever you are, and so on and so forth. So in the Islamic tradition, there are many such traditions which have developed. I classify the tasawwuf tradition in three types. One is, I call it the Sufism of Rumi, Jalaluddin Rumi, which is very experiential. You experience God in his life so much that you start dancing. It's an emotional and physical response. It is like the response of Musa alayhi salam when he saw Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and he fainted. That's ecstasy. You faint with this ecstatic experience of the divine. You feel the presence of God. That is the Sufism of Rumi. And people have tried to get this partly through music, through poetry, etc. Excessive zikr, fasting, hunger, all of these which make certain senses acute and sharper. Then there is the tasawwuf and philosophy of Ibn al-Arabi, which is extremely philosophical and speculative. Ibn al-Arabi makes such profound arguments. He said something very interesting. He says, why do men and women love each other? And he said, it's very obvious that when God made Adam, and from Adam's rib he made women. So when a woman loves a man, it is homesickness. She's homesick to go back to where she came from. That's why a woman loves a man. And a man loves for a woman because he loves a part of himself that is missing. And God replaced the place from where he built a woman with a little space which filled a longing for that part of his that is missing. So men love women because there's something missing from them. And women want to go back home, so they feel homesick. He also makes a very interesting argument. He says Adam is the first mother because Adam gave birth to Hawa from here. So it's a very interesting way of thinking of it. So, but it's more speculative, philosophical, intellectual. So if you are the kind of person who gets ecstatic by reading books, then yes, take a nice cup of tea, sit down and read it in Arabic. If you like to listen, go listen to the Sufat Ali Khan and experience the Sama that Rumi did. In the middle of this is what we call the Sharia-based Sufism of Imam al-Ghazali and the Sharia-based Sufism of, in India, you Sir Hindi, Sheikh Rabbani of India, Sir Hindi. They made sure that as long as you pursue tasawwuf, you make sure that you don't violate the rules of Islamic law. So these are traditions. Today, America is moving a great deal in the direction of Ghazali. You know, I remember having a very interesting conversation with Yasser Qadi, and he was trying to explain to me how that there's a debate going on in North America between Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah. And he said that people like Hamza, Yusuf, etc., are the inheritors of Ghazali, and he obviously was claiming to be the spokesperson for Ibn Taymiyyah. But even now, he has abandoned his old tradition, so you can see the domination of this soft Sufi approach of Ghazali, which is appealing to more and more Americans, American Muslims, and is becoming quite dominant. The rise of REIS in Canada conference. I've never been to it, but I'm sure some people from here have driven up to a revival of Islamic spirit. What they're reviving is traditional Islam, and Ghazali is the poster child of that. So what I wanted to do today was to introduce to you these various traditions, read them up. There are some simple books, like Masjid Isa has a simple book, 160 pages, Introduction to Islamic Philosophy, Theology, etc. Just read it. He will give you an introduction to all these different Muslim scholars, Islamic law scholar, who was Abu Hanifa, to who was Ibn Arabi, to who was Ibn Sina. Then there are, of course, specialized books, and if you want to do that, call me. I will tell you if you want to specialize in certain debates, etc. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. I'm done for today. Yes?
I had a question regarding the classical debate about is the Quran created or uncreated. The first question I had was the term "to create." What does that term mean from an Islamic scholarly position? And the second question I had was, from my understanding, the Mutazilites did not, or they were opposed to certain unseen realms, such as that described in the Quran dealing with Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam. So how were they considered their positions valid when they even denied certain realities described by the Quran?
There are two different questions. See, the religious, the concept of creation, which is the same for Muslims, Jews, and Christians, and most religions. The idea of creation is to bring something ex nihilo, something which did not exist into existence, something which was not matter into matter, right? That is what we mean, creation. But there are some very fascinating ayahs. There's an ayah in the Quran which says, we have created life and death to test you. And that really threw a curved one at Muslim scholars. They said, what does it mean to create death? See, God has also created death, and He has created life. It's impossible for me to, I have an intuitive idea of what it means by creating death. It's an experience. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that every soul must experience death. So God has created a particular experience which we must, like sexual experience, it's an experience, right? It is not a thing, but God created that experience, that this moment that you feel certain things. So God's creation is to manifest that which did not exist. But if you were to study Ibn al-Arabi, for example, Ibn al-Arabi had a very profound take on it. It really throws you off. So I might end up confusing you more, but I'll give you more thought. Like, for example, Ibn Arabi says, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, kun fayakun, He's saying, be and it becomes. He said, God is ordering. This was used in the case of Isa, he says, be. So there are things which exist in non-existence. And when Allah orders them, by Allah's order, they manifest into existence. So who is responding to Allah's order to be? So what is more sophisticated philosophical and Sufi understanding is that a lot of things that you see exist as ideas in Ghaib. So we exist in God's concept. That's also what Plato says, ideas and forms. So we exist as an idea in God's thought, and when He creates us, He simply manifests us. It becomes zahir, from hidden status. So that is one way of thinking of creation, is that God is manifesting it. His thoughts, He's just bringing it. Muslim philosophers have looked at things that exist as not real. The only thing that is real is God. Everything else is temporary. And it is temporary, it's like a hologram that exists only as long as Allah's tawajjuh is on it. As long as God is concentrating on you and me, He's projecting our existence into the seen world. The moment He ceases to do that, turns the light off, you're gone. And you're gone into the world of the unseen. So that is one way of thinking about it. One thing to understand is that the big mystery of life, this is what Native Americans call it, right? The big mystery. The big mystery is that we can only have contingent understandings of this. And that's where your maqam in life, as you rise in life and you become, God gives you these understandings. So the second part about the earth is that The problem with human knowledge says we try to seek to be consistent if they cannot encompass all data. So the Mu'tazilite doctrine developed in response to certain issues. And so for them, it was to some extent a slightly superficial thing. How can God create? I mean, why is the Quran co-eternal with God? Doesn't that compromise monotheism? Right? Like I told you now, there are three things actually. The name of Abu Lahab. I mean, why should his name be eternal before and after creation? Right? Doesn't make sense to me. But the traditional position is that anything and everything that God says is Quran. The Prophet ﷺ prohibited his companions from asking questions all the time. They don't ask me questions, because if you ask me questions, then Quran will come. We were afraid that the Quran would have become huge. Like imagine 30 volumes of Quran and you're trying to memorize. So when strangers came to town, the Sahaba used to be very thrilled because now the strangers would not follow the rules, they would ask questions. So everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says is the Quran. So for those traditional positions, the speech of God is Quran. And speech of God is not created because God is not created. I hope that makes some sense. We have 4 more minutes, and there is another question. Oh, good answer.
Yeah, just a comment. You mentioned about Malaysia. It seems like in many ways, in the positive sense, they are making progress and becoming more of a role model for the rest of the Islamic world. At least that's my take on it. Because a couple of years back, when I was in Saudi Arabia, there was a presentation made by the physician and scientist from Malaysia, where their presentation was about Islamization of the medical work.
Mm-hmm.
And to my surprise, sitting on the same table later on, we were discussing, and a Saudi said, "What do you mean by that?" He said, "Well, it's very easy for you because of where you are living to Islamize everything." And these were simple things. He said, for example, in our hospital, and they had 20 or 40 hospitals already in Malaysia who were following that every azan, every corner of the hospital you can listen.
Yeah.
And things like that, separate for female and male. And not only that, wherever possible, even the physicians are gender matching.
See, those are superficial things. It's like putting green curtains in the hospital and saying this is Islamic hospital. Or even saying that all our doctors, all our gynecologists are women. That is not serious. The serious assumption is that what does medicine presuppose is the human purpose? I mean, why do you want to constantly prolong life, or take questions of when do you end trying, when you pull off the ventilator? Some of these philosophical questions need to be answered. But with Malaysia, I don't know how to put it and still remain politically correct, but philosophy died in the Arab world, but not in the rest of the Muslim world. So you still see a lot of scientific progress in non-Arab parts of the Muslim world than primarily in the Arab world. For example, IIU Malaysia, which is the biggest project in Malaysia, which is trying to integrate sciences and knowledge, is the same project as IIU Islamabad. So there is an Islamic university in Islamabad too. Both funded by the Saudis, but there is no IIU in Saudi Arabia. Okay. So we have only 1 more minute to go. Thank you very much for all of you for coming, and those of you who have been watching on TV, please feel free to send me your questions by email.